Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today's Tuesday, October 14th, day 739 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Times of Israel editor David Horovitz. So thank you so much for joining me on this Simchat Torah holiday, David.
Thank you, Amanda.
Today, after the release of the final 20 living hostages yesterday, for the first time in 2 years, many, if not most, Israelis are able to finally feel the commanded joy of the Simchat Torah holiday, in which the 5 books of the Torah are finished and the scroll is restarted here in Israel. However, countering agreed upon phase 1 of the Trump peace plan, at recording time, only 4 of the 28 dead hostages have been returned so far. So we'll speak about the push-pull, joy, and despair here in Israel. And as I promised yesterday on the daily briefing, we'll dive into U.S. President Donald Trump's lengthy speech at the Knesset ahead of his summit in Egypt. So all of this and more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our editor, David Horovitz. The International Committee of the Red Cross said that it will take time before the bodies of all dead hostages are returned, calling it a, quote, massive challenge given the difficulties of finding remains amid Gaza's rubble. Hamas yesterday handed over the bodies of 4 dead hostages, with Israel and the families of the remaining 24 accusing the terror group of breaching its commitments under the ceasefire. The Hostages and Missing Families Forum said that it will hold an emergency meeting tonight, and amid growing anger, the Israeli government's point man on the hostages, Gal Hirsch, told the families that pressure on the terror group will continue and intensify until it has kept to its commitments. David, this is also important, but let's turn first to the joy of seeing our final 20 living hostages back home. They were freed. They will undergo intensive medical testing and examination. But most importantly, the 20 men that were released yesterday have been reunited with their parents and siblings. And these are, of course, the pictures that moved us all. So what struck you the most, David, upon their return?
Well, yeah, it was incredibly emotional and inspiring and joyful, which is just, all of that is already a complicated thing to say because it was terrible. These were people who had been held for 2 years. And in specific cases, we know they were in tunnels. Some were alone, chained, fears for their lives. Absolutely. We'd seen material coming out, digging their own graves, looking utterly emaciated, taken in this act of psychological torture to watch their friends being freed in one staged ceremony of a release not so many months ago. So that we felt joy is true. And the reunions, the clips, the families only, the clips come out, many of which we've shown on the Times of Israel, only with the consent of the families. And therefore the families have been prepared to allow Israel to see the emotion of those moments. And they're wrenching in their joy, the way people respond to something that is unthinkable, that their father or their husband or their child has come back after 2 years. So it's incredibly joyful, but like I say, it's wrenching, the sounds that people make in these videos. And I'm not trying to be melodramatic here, I'm just trying to explain it. They're not normal sounds. They are sounds that come from in your soul, from deep in your body, uncontrolled mixture of utter joy and the release of pain. So, hopefully that conveys some of the sense of this. And therefore you have a nation that was rejoicing. And it was rejoicing, I think, hugely as well, because we're going to talk a bit about the non-returned fallen hostages. But those releases of the 20, by the terrible standards that we have come to expect, were smooth. There were not massive delays. There were not horrific ceremonies. They were not made to walk a gauntlet through baying crowds, where, again, some of them said subsequently in previous releases that they feared they were going to be torn apart. They were handed over. And we learned that they were with the Red Cross, and there were some phone calls before and all kinds of psychological efforts going on there, where some of the second group of 13, some of them spoke to their parents and loved ones with Hamas people next to them, in the frame of the phone. requiring and saying things to them. But broadly, these processes of their release yesterday were uneventful, relatively speaking, and there they were back in Israel. And also the first sight of them was less harrowing, I think, than, never mind the public, than their families had anticipated. The experts warn us, don't be fooled by this. I think you'd have to be pretty obtuse to be fooled by people looking superficially, unaffected. I mean, how can they not have been unaffected in the most extreme ways and traumatized utterly? But they looked relatively healthy. They emoted. They were capable of interacting warmly, and these reunions. I mean, there are endless stories here, but the Omri Miran, who comes back to his two little daughters who were 6 months and 2.5 when he was kidnapped. In other words, his younger daughter had known him for a fifth of her life. And it was the first 6 months. Who is this person who has been talked about endlessly? And now here he is. Every single case has variations on those unthinkable stories. So the joy of their release, tempered by a national understanding that this was horrific and unforgivable, and that we now have to do everything that we can, everybody who interacts with those families, to help them and support them and make sure it never happens again. And then you come to the issue of those bodies, those fallen who are not yet back.
Right. Tomorrow, Jessica Steinberg and I will discuss the status of the hostages who returned. We're going to hear more in depth of the stories of their reunion, so stay tuned for that. Let's turn to the issue of the 24 dead hostages who have not been returned. And I think this also leads to what many listeners have been asking me: why do I continue to say the day of the war? Because at least from my perspective, the war is not over. We have not received our dead hostages back. We have not received all the promises that were made to us from the first phase of the Trump deal. Now, what do you think about this aspect, David?
Well, it's an editorial decision, so ultimately it's mine. And the two reasons why...
Yes, true.
No, I'm not. We've discussed it. It's fine. There's two reasons why I think it's inappropriate to not counting the days of a war. And one is the most kind of technical, I suppose, which is Israel declared war on October the 7th. There are legal implications to this. And although President Donald Trump, who brokered the deal or pushed the deal that saw the releases yesterday, has repeatedly said the war is over. He said it in the Knesset yesterday. He said it on his plane on the way over. He said it in that conversation when it was put to him. The Prime Minister hasn't said the war's over, and Trump was like, the war is over, the war is over. Okay, you understand? So there should be no doubt that Trump considers the war to be over, but Israel, which declared it, has not said that. Netanyahu came close to saying that yesterday. Trump congratulated him for doing it yesterday, but the Prime Minister has not ended the war. And again, even more technically, the government last Thursday, Friday, voted, and nobody else has made any effort really, or made a comparable effort, shall we say, that I know of, to work out what exactly the government voted for. But they did not vote to endorse the Sharm document, which begins with Trump has ended the war, and then has a second clause that says the war will end when the Israeli government recognizes that, or something. You can look up the wording, we've got it. They didn't vote on that document. They did not endorse a document that says the war is over. They endorsed the first phase of this deal. They were very clear about that. They discussed the Sharm document as far as we can understand. They did not, it was not included in the relevant appendices of the resolution that they approved. And the second thing is your point, of course, which is, just yesterday, there were in the morning 48 hostages in Gaza. Today, there are 24 hostages in Gaza. Half of them did not come back. We should note, by the way, the degree to which Trump has understood this. There's barely a reference of any length when he discusses the hostages, when he does not talk about the imperative to receive the dead as well. He has been so struck by this. Like, he found it worth remarking upon time after time that when he speaks to the families of the hostages, the families of the dead want them back as much as the families of the living did, or we can now say do, that they have to be brought back for burial, that circle has to be closed. And what is emerging in the last few hours, and really it was percolating through the day when the focus was on, thank God, the living are dead. And let's not underestimate that. And let's not put that aside casually. For the first time in 2 years, there are no living Israelis held hostage by terrorist groups in Gaza, right? But all through the day, it was clear that there was something wrong. And then you start to look back at this agreement. And Yael Adar, who is one of the mothers of a slain Israeli who has not come back, was, I think, the most, not just outspoken, but the most, very coherent as to the problem. She said when she looked, if you start, we have an article on the site right now, talks about the interview that she gave on television last night, but it also explains the points that she was making. The original Trump plan, the 20-point Trump plan, which is the basis for this deal, didn't really leave wiggle room, as far as I can understand. It was all the hostages must be released within 72 hours of the ceasefire, the living and the dead. That's basically what it says. But the Shalom agreement has a point with multiple subclauses, and if you can figure out what they enable, your mind is sharper than mine. It's very, very complicated, and her charge really was not that definitively Hamas has breached the deal, but rather that the deal was poorly formulated, and also that the leverage in the deal, in the deal signed last Thursday, the operational deal, if you like, that the leverage was misconstrued or foolishly accepted by Israel because, first of all the living hostages were to be exchanged for something like 2,000 in total Palestinian detainees, including 250 convicted murderers, including some of the most notorious and dangerous and mass-killing terrorists that Israel has encountered. And that's what happened yesterday. The 20 came home, and then the prisoners were freed. And then 4 of 28 came home, and the provisions in the agreement were for each one who comes for who is each body that is returned, 15 bodies of Palestinians, detainees, prisoners, I don't know exactly, are to be returned. And she said, well, that's not sufficient leverage. She said she warned about this last week. It's inexplicable. It's inexplicable to me. Why did they move from the from the very clear-cut terms? And was this something that Hamas planned all along? And I would add into that, there was no expectation, public expectation, that something as minimal as 4 bodies only would be returned yesterday. There was an expectation that up to, I think the highest number I saw of the 28 was up to 15 might not be returned. But there were multiple reports. The Times of Israel was, we were told stuff that we were asked not to report. I think it's safe to say now that there was one point where we were told that 9 bodies had not been located. There was a CNN story that put the range at 7 to 15. So in even a worst case scenario that the public was aware of, half, at least, maybe slightly less than half, likely much more than half of those 28 bodies were to be returned. And instead there were 4. And then you get to the additional unconfirmed reports that Qatar in Sharm told the Israelis that Hamas has something like 15 or 16 of the bodies and is trying to locate others, and that might take a little more time. As far as things stand now, and things change all the time, it seems clear to me that this was something that Hamas had planned, that they sought terms of a deal that would allow them to state that they had not breached the deal, and the result is what we're seeing playing out. There is an emphatic Israeli commitment to keep up the search, and when it is possible to have Israeli and other teams looking in Gaza. But the bottom line is that something extremely problematic played out yesterday and is playing out, and as things stand, there is no reason but to think that this is something that Hamas had in mind all along in the last few days.
If you think about leverage on the Israeli side, David, I can't help but think that if the body of Yichai Sinwar, for example, were dangled in front of Hamas as, give us all of our dead hostages back, and maybe we'll consider giving you back your dead leader, that might be some kind of incentive. But this was taken off the table quite early, as I understand it.
I think there's all manner of formulations that could have reduced the likelihood of this. That's certainly one of them, but that's pretty drastic. What about we don't release anybody until all the living and the dead are freed, or that's what I thought the original conception was, by the way, that Israel would need to be credibly assured that Hamas had returned everybody that it could for the other side of the exchange to go ahead. And that understanding is not reflected in the agreement that was signed in Sharm last Thursday. I want to put caveats here. As far as I can tell, this is what I understand, and I've looked at the documents and I've spoken to people. This is my understanding as of now.
Okay, let's go to a short break. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our editor, David Horovitz. So yesterday afternoon, after the 20 living hostages returned home and U.S. President Donald Trump had flown over the length and breadth of Israel to take in the very grateful Israeli people, Trump spoke at the Knesset and declared, quote, the historic dawn of the new Middle East. Trump said it marked, quote, not only the end of the war, but the end of an age of terror and death and the beginning of the age of faith and hope and of God. And in what was maybe a warning to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he told the lawmakers that Israel had no more to achieve on the battlefield and must work towards peace in the Middle East. David, let's start with the atmosphere at the Knesset. It was something noteworthy, I would say.
What would you call it? Festive?
Festive, celebratory, a circus. There was the burst from the Arab parties. There's so much going on there.
I think it was broadly festive, and he was pretty adroit, and he departed many times from his prepared text in all kinds of predictable and less predictable directions. He called for a pardon, not the first time, for Netanyahu, but he did it in the parliament. He asked the president to pardon Netanyahu. I think he said subsequently he wasn't planning to do that, but he kind of got a bit carried away. We've reported all of this, obviously. There was a very minor interruption where two Knesset members from the mainly Arab Hadash-Ta'al party were removed, one of whom was holding a sign saying recognize Palestine. And Trump was, completely unfazed, very efficient, he said, and he carried on speaking. It began with a long standing ovation. There were a lot of shouts of, applause and support for Trump. There was a lot of applauding for Netanyahu. It was a partisan gathering to some extent, as you would expect in an Israeli parliament. Some of the things that Trump said went down pretty well with almost all parts of the House, obviously not in some of the Arab benches, as I've mentioned. And there was material there that was much more happily received by members of Netanyahu's coalition than those of the opposition. Broadly speaking, and by Israeli Knesset standards, which can be, very raucous, it was, broadly speaking, like I say, fairly well-behaved and enthusiastic. And Trump was, played to all his strength there and managed this feat of congratulating Netanyahu for ending a war, as I've said, that Netanyahu has not said that he ended, criticizing, really, the handling of the war to some extent. It went on for a long time, was getting heated, was getting bad. There's some really interesting quotes, and praising Netanyahu for having the guts, as Trump said, to end it now and not keeping it going, kill, kill, kill. That's a quote, those 6 words. So he kind of said this was not going in a good direction. And you saw that, you realized that, and you did a very courageous thing, which I'm not entirely sure is completely how things played out, given that we know that Netanyahu, for example, was unimpressed by Hamas's response to Trump's proposal and was moving to brand it as essentially a rejection, whereas Trump ignored the multiple caveats and conditions that Hamas had put in its response and said, hey, they want peace, off we go. So it was very interesting in terms of how Trump presented that, and very, very effective. I mean, he left Netanyahu very, very happy. He praised him. He said he was great. But he also said things like, hey, you can be a bit nicer now, Bibi, now that you're no longer in a war, right? There were those kinds of very cleverly phrased moments.
thought it was also interesting in terms of Netanyahu's remarks. He said something along the lines of, "You are the best American president friend Israel has ever had, and I've been around for a very long time," which to me was also saying to Trump, "Hey, your term is going to end, and I will stay here."
I think that's very true and well spotted. For all that Trump is the king of the world and the leader of the world and bends nations to his will, certainly to some extent. Okay, there are in introducing this just now, you spoke about what he said. This is a new era for the Middle East, the end of the era for terror, he said. Right? Well, please God, but we wait to see. And he did, build this coalition, but we didn't touch on this yet. This summit in Egypt that followed Trump's visit to Israel, Netanyahu chose not to go. Did he choose not to go because he thought his coalition would be upset with him if he went hobnobbing with Mahmoud Abbas and Turkey's President Erdogan? Or is it because Erdogan's plane was circling and he wasn't going to land in Sharm if Netanyahu accepted the reluctant invitation presented last minute by Egypt's President Sisi at Trump's urging? So big claims being made by Trump, but you're right. Netanyahu is saying, I'm gonna be here as far as I'm planning after you're no longer the president. I've been around a long time.
So let's talk about the summit. And we've published the full declaration that U.S. President Donald Trump and the leaders of Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey signed yesterday. So the idea is to enshrine the Gaza ceasefire and hostage release deal between Israel and Hamas. And they began discussing the rebuilding of Gaza. So today, Erdogan said he would seek the support of Gulf states, the United States, and Europe for the reconstruction of Gaza, and he believes project financing will be provided swiftly. I think most Israelis are, really filled with disbelief that any kind of phase 2 will actually begin happening. But the bulldozer-ridness of U.S. President Donald Trump kind of seems to have put the wheels into motion. So what are you thinking, David?
First of all, congratulations on adding a new word to the dictionary there. What I wrote last week is, can Trump actually persuade Hamas to release all the hostages? And for a few hours yesterday, we had the right to think, well, apparently so. And now we're not so sure. And the wider question that we ask is Hamas going to consent to its own demise? Right? That's what this is all about. It's about whether Israel is going to leave the room for that to happen potentially. It's about whether other nations are really going to get involved here, including actual people in Gaza doing stuff. And all of that hinges on whether Hamas is going to say, okay, we tried to destroy Israel and we brought death and devastation down on Gaza, which we didn't really care about, but which we got the world to blame Israel for. And now we're going to, we couldn't do it. And we should give Gazans a better life alongside Israel. This has been the big point of contention. Steve Witkoff, about whom many, many, many good things must be said. And Trump said many yesterday, and the families. But he said to Trump, Hamas is not intractable ideologically, but Hamas is intractable ideologically. Its whole essence is to destroy Israel and kill Jews. And everything that is being described as, if you like, phase 2, requires Hamas to say, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. Now, there's middle ground here. Maybe they will take a genuine backseat in Gaza for some time. They're incredibly strong in the West Bank. They have all sorts of other tentacles. And you have people like Erdogan and Qatar mediating a deal with a terrorist organization that in both cases, I would say, they support. Right? Directly, publicly, relentlessly in the case of Erdogan, practically in the case of Qatar with funding. Al Jazeera is basically a tool in its Arabic iteration for inciting hostility to Israel around the world, most especially in this part of the world. So the circumstances for this, you say Israelis, broadly speaking, don't think phase 2 is going to happen. I don't know how widely Israelis don't think phase 2. In other words, a day after Gaza is going to happen. But I think if you're not deeply skeptical, and if you're not deeply skeptical because of Hamas, then you're missing the very large, violent, vicious, barbaric, cynical Hamas elephant in the room here.
I mean, if you just look at what is happening in the Gaza Strip, in the areas where the IDF has pulled back, already we're seeing, I think, verified videos of Hamas gunmen in the streets gunning down Gazans who may have voiced some kind of anti-Hamas sentiment throughout the war. We're seeing this being played out in front of our very eyes. And this is not, one or two incidents. This is happening throughout the Strip. And as we reported throughout at least the past year of war, there have been 3 militias that have risen up and said that they were anti-Hamas and tried to fill in the vacuum a little bit. Only one of them in the Rafah area, where Hamas is not, where the IDF still is still active. The Abu Shabaab militia is still active. The other 2, we're not hearing anything from them right now since Hamas regained control of the Strip.
Regain control of something less than half of the Strip, but regain control of, or is the IDF is not deployed in almost half of the Strip. There's a lot of material coming out. Our reporter did a piece, I think, 2 days ago, which you're referencing here, about the violence and the militias and so on. I mean, Hamas, again, I don't need to tell Times of Israel listeners, I don't think, but this began on October the 7th when Hamas invaded from a territory with no Israeli presence. The only Jewish Israeli in Gaza was Hadar Goldin, the body of a soldier that it had held since 2014. They could have built, Trump is derided for his talk of the Middle East Riviera, but they could have turned Gaza into a good place to live. There was a great deal of goodwill in the first years after Israel pulled out in 2005. Instead, Hamas took over in 2007, built a war machine, and invaded. Right? That's what Hamas is. It took a territory where it had full control, and Israel never wanted to go back there and refused to believe that it would have to. But Hamas decided to basically operate its ideology, and it invaded, and it would have destroyed Israel on October the 7th, 2023, if it had been able to, if Iran had pitched in, if Hezbollah had entered. That was the goal. That's who these people are. And therefore, if they have the chance, they will rebuild. And therefore, skepticism is not just skepticism. All the necessary precautions must be taken. And, the notion, there's endless criticism of the Prime Minister here. The 2 prime goals of the war were and are essential. Get back all the hostages and destroy Hamas / make sure Hamas cannot do this again. Those are essential goals. And, if you're asking sort of how Israelis feel, the bottom line is you can talk victory all you like, but the first of those goals, there's 24 dead hostages who have not been returned, and Hamas has not been destroyed. Massively weakened, some more marginalized, not an army, but not destroyed. And, that doesn't mean every last Hamas fighter. It means an environment is created in which it cannot pursue its goals of destroying Israel, killing Jews, certainly from Gaza. That was an overt goal of the war, and I don't think you can fairly claim victory in the sense that that Israelis can feel comfortable. Now, a phase 2, if it were implemented, would represent that, right? Presumably, every possible dead hostage's body would be returned, and multiple nations would pile in to create a different environment in which Hamas would not be able to operate, would be utterly marginalized. And therefore, we want a workable phase 2. It's just the concern that the way this is being presented is very, very confident, and it does not take, the concern at least, that it doesn't take into account the essence of what Hamas is.
David, we have much more to discuss, but that will happen in other episodes. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Take care, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another episode tomorrow. This episode was produced by Adina Karpuch. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other installment, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.